know why I stopped you tonight, sir?
No, officer. Could you please clarify the reason for the stop?
Step out of the vehicle so I can take a quick look inside, all right?
The flashing red and blue lights painted the rain-slicked asphalt of the quiet suburban street, illuminating the tight, white-knuckled grip of a man who knew the law far better than the officer pulling him over. It was supposed to be a routine traffic stop, an inconvenience on a Tuesday night, but in the span of 3 agonizing minutes, it dissolved into a dangerous, quiet war of constitutional rights, unspoken assumptions, and a procedural misstep that would change 3 lives forever. Listen to the ambient hum of a high-end steakhouse winding down for the night. The sharp, rhythmic clinking of heavy silver forks against porcelain plates. The low, melodic bass line of a jazz quartet in the corner, and the murmur of hushed, wealthy conversations floating through the dimly lit room. Marcus sat at a corner booth, swirling the last half-inch of an expensive bourbon in his glass. He was 38, a senior defense attorney at a downtown firm, a man whose entire career was built on reading the microscopic shifts in human behavior. His suit was tailored, his demeanor perpetually calm, forged by years of cross-examining hostile witnesses. Across from him sat his younger brother, Julien. Julien was an architect, 26, vibrating with the residual adrenaline of having just landed his first major design contract. He was wearing a casual but expensive cashmere sweater, laughing a little too loud, completely at ease in the affluent, predominantly white enclave of Oak Ridge. They were celebrating, but even amid the celebration, Marcus's trained eyes caught the subtle, lingering glances from the hostess stand. The way the bartender's gaze hung on their table just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. It wasn't overt hostility. It was the quiet, invisible friction of being 2 black men in a space where they were subconsciously perceived as anomalies. Marcus didn't mention it to Julien. There was no need to ruin the night. The heavy wooden doors of the restaurant sealed shut behind them with a muffled thud, cutting off the warmth and the jazz, replacing it with the sharp, biting chill of a November wind. The parking lot was sprawling and poorly lit, shadows stretching long and distorted beneath the flickering amber glow of the sodium street lamps. Gravel crunched beneath their dress shoes. Julien pulled his keys from his pocket, but the cold made his fingers clumsy. The heavy metal fob slipped, clattering against the asphalt and skittering under the chassis of his sleek, late model Audi. Julien groaned, dropping to his knees, leaning down to sweep his hands blindly beneath the dark undercarriage of the vehicle. Marcus stood nearby, pulling his wool overcoat tighter against the wind, watching his brother curse softly as he reached further under the car. From the perspective of a casual observer across the street, the optics were ambiguous. A dark figure kneeling beside an expensive car in the shadows, seemingly tampering with the undercarriage. It was a mundane moment, an annoyance, but in the sprawling suburbs where neighborhood watch apps hummed with perpetual paranoia, context was easily stripped away. A passing resident, walking their golden retriever along the perimeter fence, paused, pulled out a cell phone, and dialed a non-emergency number, whispering a vague but loaded description to a tired dispatcher. A suspicious individual, dark clothing, messing around with a luxury vehicle. 5 minutes later, Julien was finally behind the wheel. The heater blasting, the engine purring a low, steady rhythm. Marcus leaned his head against the cool glass of the passenger window, watching the manicured lawns of Oak Ridge glide by. The interior of the Audi smelled of rich leather and the faint trace of Julien's cologne. The silence was comfortable, broken only by the soft, rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers, brushing away a light drizzle. Then, the silence shattered. The blare of a siren, a short, aggressive whoop that sent an immediate, icy spike of adrenaline straight through Julien's chest. The rearview mirror violently erupted into a blinding strobe of red and blue. Julien's hands instantly seized the steering wheel. his knuckles turning pale. Marcus sat up slowly, his body language instantly shifting from relaxed brother to hypervigilant attorney. He didn't panic, but his jaw set. He glanced at the speedometer. Julian was doing 28 in a 30 zone, both hands on the wheel. Turn signal clicking with a steady metronomic stick. Julian guided the car smoothly to the shoulder, the tires crunching against the wet gravel. The engine was cut. The heavy, suffocating silence returned, amplified by the blinding glare of the cruiser's spotlights flooding the cabin. Through the side mirrors, Marcus watched the heavy cruiser doors swing open, listened to the heavy, deliberate crunch of tactical boots on the wet asphalt. It was Officer Reynolds. Reynolds wasn't a rookie. He had 12 years on the force. He was a man who prided himself on his gut instincts, a cop who firmly believed he could smell a liar before they ever opened their mouth. But 12 years of relying on a gut feeling often meant 12 years of reinforcing unchecked, subtle biases. Reynolds approached the vehicle with a practiced, predatory caution. His right hand rested casually, yet deliberately, on the butt of his service weapon. His flashlight beam sliced through the rainy darkness, aggressively sweeping the back seats, the floorboards, and finally resting, blindingly bright, right on Julian's face. Julian squinted, raising a hand to shield his eyes. His voice, usually confident and resonant, came out thin and tight. He asked, politely, what the problem was. Reynolds didn't answer immediately. The silence was a tactic, a way to establish dominance, to let the tension rise until someone cracked. When Reynolds finally spoke, his tone was flat, authoritative, and laced with an undercurrent of deep suspicion. He demanded license, registration, and proof of insurance, completely bypassing the customary explanation for the stop. Julian's hands trembled slightly as he reached toward the glove compartment. Marcus, sitting perfectly still in the passenger seat, spoke up, his voice a low, calm rumble that cut through the sharp tension of the car. He instructed Julian to tell the officer exactly what he was reaching for before he moved. Julian echoed the words, his voice shaking. Reynolds watched them, his flashlight beam never wavering, his mind spinning a narrative that fit his preconceived notions. Tow men late at night, nervous, in a high-end car registered in a different zip code to Reynolds. The nervousness wasn't the natural byproduct of an armed man shining a light in their faces. It was an indicator of guilt. Reynolds took the documents and retreated to his cruiser. The rain continued to fall. Inside the Audi, Julian was breathing shallowly, gripping the steering wheel so hard his arms ached. Marcus remained stone-faced, his mind rapidly cataloging every detail, every word spoken, every procedural step. He knew the law. A traffic stop is a seizure under the Fourth Amendment. The police need reasonable, articulable suspicion of a traffic violation to initiate the stop, and they are legally bound to diligently investigate that specific violation. They cannot prolong the stop to embark on a fishing expedition without new, independent suspicion. Marcus watched the rearview mirror. Reynolds was in his cruiser for a long time. Too long for a simple license check. When Reynolds finally returned, the rain had picked up, drumming a heavy rhythm against the roof of the car. He didn't hand the license back. Instead, he leaned in slightly, the beam of his flashlight dropping to illuminate the center console. He asked Julian where they were coming from. Julian, eager to comply, quickly explained they had just finished dinner at the steakhouse down the road. Reynolds' eyes narrowed slightly. He asked whose car it was. Julian confirmed it was his. Reynolds then shifted his stance, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into an interrogatory rhythm. He asked if there were any weapons in the car. Julian said no. He asked if there were any large sums of currency. Julian said no. Then Reynolds asked the question that shifted the entire dynamic of the night. He asked Julian if he wouldn't mind stepping out of the vehicle so he could take a quick look inside just to make sure everything was safe. This was the pivot. The moment a routine inquiry bleeds into a constitutional violation, Reynolds had no probable cause to search. He had no reasonable suspicion of a secondary crime. He was operating purely on a deeply ingrained, biased assumption that these two men did not belong here, and therefore they must be hiding something. Julien, intimidated and wanting the ordeal to end, began to reach for the door handle. Marcus's hand shot out, gently but firmly grasping Julian's forearm, stopping him cold. Marcus turned his head, locking eyes with Reynolds through the rain-streaked window. The lawyer's voice was remarkably steady, devoid of anger, but carrying the heavy, immovable weight of authority. He asked Officer Reynolds politely what the reasonable, articulable suspicion was for the stop. Reynolds blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by the precise legal terminology. He recovered quickly, his tone hardening, stating that Julian's license plate light was allegedly out, a pretextual stop, legal, but flimsy. Marcus nodded slowly, accepting the premise, but immediately challenging the escalation. He informed Reynolds that a burned out bulb is an infraction, a ticketable offense, and asked if Reynolds was writing a citation. If so, Marcus calmly stated they would wait for the ticket. If not, he asked if they were free to go. Reynolds felt a flush of heat in the back of his neck. His authority was being challenged, not with aggression, but with procedure. He leaned closer to the window, his voice taking on a sharper, more aggressive edge. He told Marcus that he was speaking to the driver, not the passenger, and that if they had nothing to hide, a quick search shouldn't be a problem. Marcus didn't flinch. He stated clearly, for the record, and for the body camera he knew was recording on Reynolds' chest, that his brother did not consent to any searches of his vehicle or his person. He then introduced himself. He didn't brag. He didn't threaten. He simply stated his name, his profession as a defense attorney, and gently reminded the officer of the Supreme Court ruling in Rodriguez v. United States, which explicitly prohibits police from prolonging a traffic stop beyond the time reasonably required to complete the mission of issuing a ticket unless there is independent, reasonable suspicion. The silence that followed was suffocating. The rain beat against the metal roof. The radio on Reynolds' shoulder hissed with static. Reynolds was trapped. He knew the law, even if he often stretched it. He had no drugs in plain view, no smell of contraband, no furtive movements. He had a nervous driver and an attorney who was politely laying a legal trap that could jeopardize his career. The tension hung in the damp air. Thick and volatile, Reynolds' hand remained near his weapon. He was running the calculus in his head. Call for a K-9 unit. That would take 20 minutes. A clear violation of the Rodriguez ruling, turning an illegal detention into an easily winnable civil rights lawsuit, forced them out. Without probable cause, any evidence found would be fruit of the poisonous tree, suppressed in court, and he would face an internal affairs investigation for an unlawful search. The standoff was broken, not by a dramatic escalation, but by the cold, mechanical voice of police dispatch crackling over Reynolds' shoulder radio. The dispatcher's voice was clear, cutting through the rain. They were canceling the suspicious person call at the steakhouse. The manager had reviewed the security footage. It was just a patron looking for dropped keys. The suspect description was voided. Marcus watched the micro expressions flash across Reynolds' face. The sudden realization, the evaporation of his entire fabricated premise, the gut instinct, the suspicion, the aggressive posturing, it was all built on a ghost, a biased misinterpretation of a man dropping his keys in a dark parking lot. Reynolds stood up straight, stepping back from the window. The oppressive, Interrogatory energy vanished, replaced by a stiff, awkward rigidness. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge the mistake. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out Julian's license and registration, and handed them back through the window. He muttered a curt instruction to get the license plate light fixed, turned on his heel, and walked briskly back to his cruiser. Julian let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for 10 minutes. His hands shook violently as he put the car in gear. Marcus sat in silence, the adrenaline slowly receding, leaving behind a cold, heavy exhaustion. They drove away, the red and blue lights fading in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the rainy darkness. But the story didn't end in the car. The consequences of that night unfolded slowly, quietly, in the sterile, fluorescent lit corridors of the Oak Ridge Police Department. Marcus was not a man who let the system operate in the shadows. The next morning, formal, meticulously drafted complaint was filed, accompanied by a public records request for the body camera footage, the dash cam audio, and the dispatch logs. The internal affairs investigation wasn't a spectacle. It was a slow, bureaucratic grind. Chief Miller sat in his office a week later, the blinds drawn, staring at his computer monitor. He watched the body cam footage of Officer Reynolds approaching the Audi. Chief Miller was an old school cop, a man who generally backed his officers, but he was also a pragmatist. As he watched the video, listening to the tight, authoritative cadence of Reynolds' voice and the calm, legally unassailable responses from Marcus, Miller felt a sinking sensation in his gut. He saw what Reynolds couldn't see in the moment. He saw the invisible weight of bias. He saw an officer who bypassed procedure to chase a phantom suspicion based on nothing more than the demographics of the men in the car and the affluence of the neighborhood. The procedural mistake was glaring. Reynolds had unquestionably attempted to unlawfully prolong a traffic stop to conduct a baseless investigation. Miller called Reynolds into his office. There was no screaming, no dramatic tossing of a badge on a desk. It was a quiet, uncomfortable conversation about liability, constitutional rights, and the dangerous pitfalls of policing by assumption. Reynolds sat rigidly, his face pale, defensively arguing his instincts, claiming he was just being thorough. But the footage didn't lie. The dispatch logs didn't lie. The evidence painted a clear picture of a man who allowed his subconscious prejudices to override his training. Reynolds was placed on temporary administrative leave pending further review, subjected to mandatory retraining on Fourth Amendment procedures, and a permanent note regarding the violation was placed in his personnel file. It wasn't the swift, cinematic justice of a courtroom drama. It was the messy, quiet, agonizingly slow process of accountability. For Julian, the psychological toll lingered far longer than the flashing lights. He found himself hesitating before driving into certain neighborhoods, double-checking his taillights with obsessive paranoia. His sense of security permanently fractured by the realization of how quickly routine can turn into a threat. For Marcus, it was another stark reminder of the reality he navigated every day. A reality where a law degree and a tailored suit were merely temporary shields against a system that often viewed his very existence as reasonable suspicion. The incident at Oak Ridge didn't make national news. It didn't spark protests. It was just another quiet Tuesday night where the line between safety and constitutional violation was nearly erased by a single biased assumption. But as you reflect on the cold, damp parking lot, the blinding flashlight, and the tense silence in the cabin of that car, consider the fragile nature of the rights we assume are absolute. When an officer approaches your window, armed with authority and driven by an unseen prejudice, what happens when you don't know the law? What happens when the person behind the wheel isn't a seasoned attorney capable of calmly deconstructing an illegal detention in real time? The true terror of that night wasn't the threat of sudden violence. It was the chilling realization of how effortlessly the system can twist against those who are unprepared to fight it. Justice, it seems, isn't always a shield freely given. Sometimes it is a weapon you must forcefully demand